metallic crack echoing from beneath the floorboards was the sound of my life unraveling all over again. It happened miles away from anything resembling civilization, deep in the unforgiving heart of the Arizona desert. 1 second, the heavy hum of my 2004 Ford Econoline camper van was a steady, comforting rhythm against the endless stretch of cracked, sun-baked dirt. The next, a violent shudder ripped through the steering column, followed immediately by the sickening, high-pitched hiss of pressurized steam. Thick, acrid white smoke violently exploded from under the hood, instantly obscuring the windshield chill in a blinding cloud of vaporized coolant and burnt oil. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy tires skidding and kicking up a massive wake of red alkaline dust that hung in the stagnant, suffocating air. When the engine sputtered, gasped, and finally died, the sudden silence that rushed into the cabin was deafening. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic tink-tink-tink of expanding metal rapidly cooling off and the terrifying, wet bubbling sound of the radiator bleeding out its lifeblood onto the parched earth. Outside, the temperature gauge on the dashboard had been pinned at a staggering 110 degrees Fahrenheit before the electrical system went entirely dark. Inside the poorly insulated metal box of my camper van, the temperature was already spiking, turning the small space into a claustrophobic oven. The meager flow of cold air from the AC vents sputtered into a pathetic breath of hot, dusty wind before dying completely. On the center console, my half-empty plastic cup of iced coffee had long since melted, the condensation pooling and evaporating almost instantly on the scorching vinyl. I didn't look at the smoke first. I didn't reach for my phone to check for a signal. I already knew we were at least 40 miles off the grid, deliberately lost on a forgotten BLM road where nobody goes in the dead of July. Instead, my eyes immediately darted to the passenger seat. Diesel was already looking at me. He is an 80-pound rescue German Shepherd, a dog whose soul carries more scars than his battered ears. When I found him tied to a chain-link fence behind a forgotten gas station in Nevada 2 years ago, he was broken, fearful, and starving. Now, he is my shadow, my family, and the only reason I still wake up in the morning. But in this moment, looking at him tore a hole straight through my chest. Diesel had collapsed onto the blistering floor mat, his massive chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. His thick, double-layered black and tan coat, a magnificent defense against the Rocky Mountain winters we usually chased, was a death sentence out here in this apocalyptic heat. His tongue hung loosely from the side of his mouth, and his dark amber eyes were locked onto mine. He didn't whine, he didn't bark. He just stared at me with that absolute unwavering trust that only a dog possesses. He trusted me to fix this. He trusted me to keep him safe. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, though my voice cracked, betraying the sudden, icy grip of panic tightening around my throat. "I've got you. We're gonna be fine." I reached a trembling hand down to stroke his head. His fur was already alarmingly hot to the touch. He leaned into my palm, a weak but deliberate motion, seeking comfort in the very hands that had just driven him into this waking nightmare. I grabbed the door handle, the metal searing hot against my calloused skin, and pushed my way out of the van. The heat hit me like a physical blow. It felt like stepping into an industrial furnace. The air was so dry it instantly cracked the corners of my lips, and the brutal Arizona sun beat down on the back of my neck with a heavy, malicious weight. I walked around to the front of the van, the red dust crunching beneath my boots. Using an old rag, I unlatched the hood and pushed it up. A fresh wave of scalding steam hit my face, forcing me to step back, coughing violently. When the smoke finally cleared enough for me to see the damage, my stomach dropped straight into the dirt. The radiator hose hadn't just slipped. The ancient rusted metal fitting had completely blown apart. The water pump casing was cracked. Green coolant was still dripping steadily onto the scorching engine block, hissing and evaporating into thin air. It wasn't a minor fix. It wasn't something duct tape and a gallon of spare water could bandage. The engine was dead. I stumbled back, leaning my weight against the side of the van, feeling the metal burning through my t-shirt. I pulled my phone from my pocket. No service. Not even a ghost of a bar, just the word searching, flashing mockingly across the cracked screen before fading to no signal. I looked down the road we had just driven. It was a straight, endless line of cracked dirt disappearing into the shimmering heat mirages on the horizon. Nothing but sagebrush, bleached rocks, and the merciless blue sky. No cars, no dust trails, nothing. We were completely alone. I moved to the side door and slid it open. The heat inside the van was now trapped and suffocating. Diesel lifted his heavy head, his panting growing louder, more desperate. I scrambled to the back, throwing open the wooden storage bench where I kept our emergency supplies. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely undo the latch. I pulled out the blue plastic water jug. It was terrifyingly light. I shook it. The faint sloshing sound confirmed my worst fear. Yesterday, I had meant to refill it at the last truck stop, but my mind had been clouded by the anniversary of the day my life fell apart back in the city, the day my burnout consumed me, leaving my career and my marriage in ashes. I had driven right past the water station, lost in my own toxic memories. Now, because of my own brokenness, there was barely an inch of warm water left at the bottom of the jug. I looked from the nearly empty container to Diesel, who was watching me with those trusting, soulful eyes. The reality of our situation crashed over me, heavier than the desert heat. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere. The temperature was climbing past 110 degrees. The van was a metal coffin, and we had almost no water. For the first time in my life, standing alone in the American wilderness, I realized that I might not make it out of this alive. But looking at the rescue dog who had given me a second chance at life, I made a silent vow. If only one of us was going to walk out of this desert, it was going to be him. I slid down the side of the van, the scorching metal searing my spine through my thin cotton shirt, until my knees hit the cracked alkaline dirt. I pulled the hollow blue plastic jug to my chest, my hands trembling violently, and buried my face in my knees. The silence of the desert wasn't the peaceful, meditative quiet they sell you in van life magazines. It was a heavy, suffocating judge staring down at a man who had spent his entire adult life running from his own monumental failures, only to end up trapped by them. 3 years ago, I wasn't a guy breaking down in a rusted 2004 Econoline. I was a senior project manager in Chicago. I wore tailored suits, drove a car that cost more than most people's homes, and lived in a high-rise that looked down on the rest of the world. But that view came at a terrible price. 80-hour work weeks were my baseline. I lived on black coffee, adrenaline, and the toxic delusion that if I just closed one more massive deal, if I just brought home a bigger bonus, it would somehow fill the growing, silent chasm in my marriage. I thought I could buy security. I thought I could engineer love the way I engineered corporate acquisitions. I was wrong. When my wife finally left, there was no screaming match. There was no dramatic slamming of doors. Just a pair of keys left on the cold marble island of our kitchen, and a note that said she was tired of being married to a ghost. The collapse of my life wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. The burnout took everything else. My mind snapped under the immense pressure, the depression swallowing me whole until I was quietly let go from the firm. I had hollowed myself out for a world that replaced me within a week. I bought the camper van thinking the open road would be a reset button. I stripped my life down to a mattress in the back of a Ford, believing that the endless miles of asphalt, the dense Appalachian forests, and the freezing Montana air would somehow numb the memories. But pain is a stubborn passenger. It doesn't pay for gas, but it rides shotgun no matter where you go. It wasn't until I walked into a county kill shelter in Nevada and saw Diesel that I felt something other than empty. He was huddled in the darkest corner of a concrete run, terrified of his own shadow. His previous owner had kept him chained to a radiator, beating him mercilessly whenever he dared to make a sound. You could count every single rib protruding against his dull, matted coat. When I reached my hand through the chain link fence, he flinched, bracing for the impact of a strike. He expected pain from the world. I knew exactly how that felt. We didn't rescue each other that day. We recognized each other. We were two broken things trying to find a reason to keep breathing, and now, because of my own pathetic weakness, I was going to be the reason he stopped. Yesterday was the second anniversary of the day my divorce was finalized. It's a date that still wraps its cold fingers around my throat every year. I had spent the entire drive down Route 66 trapped in my own head, drowning in a toxic sea of regrets. I was so completely paralyzed by the ghosts of my past that I stared right through the windshield like a zombie. I had driven straight past the massive neon sign of the last truck stop in Kingman. I had seen the water fill station out of the corner of my eye. I had told myself I would stop at the next one, but out here, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona desert, there is no next one. The wild doesn't care about your trauma. It doesn't care that you're grieving or that you've had a hard life. Nature only respects preparation, and I had brought my own emotional baggage into an environment that demands absolute focus. I looked over at Diesel. He was panting frantically now, a dry, raspy sound that tore at my conscience. His nose, usually wet and cold, was bone dry and caked with red dust. His tongue was pale, and his amber eyes were half closed against the blinding glare of the sun. The interior of the van was easily pushing 130 degrees, a literal oven of baking metal and plastic. But outside was no better. The UV index was stripping the moisture directly from our skin, and there wasn't a single tree for miles to offer shade. I had once controlled multi-million-dollar budgets. I had managed teams of 50 brilliant people, yet here I was entirely powerless, watching my best friend slowly succumb to the heat because I was too caught up in my own self-pity to remember basic survival. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing my ribs tighter than the Arizona heat. I unscrewed the cap of the jug, staring at the pathetic, warm puddle of water at the very bottom. It wasn't enough to save a bird, let alone an 80-pound German shepherd. I was a failure in the city, and now I was a failure in the wild. 5 agonizing hours crept by, turning the Arizona afternoon into a surreal waking nightmare. The sun didn't just beat down, it possessed a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of fire that pressed us into the cracked dirt. The shadow of the dead Econoline stretched out slowly across the alkaline soil, the only refuge we had left in a landscape that actively wanted us dead. The temperature had peaked, transforming the air into a shimmering, distorted haze that made the distant horizon look like it was violently trembling. My body was beginning to shut down. The early panic had evaporated, replaced by a slow, creeping lethargy that terrified me more than the initial shock. The signs of severe dehydration were impossible to ignore. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, irregular rhythm, struggling to pump thickening blood. My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing in my periphery every time I tried to stand and scan the empty road. My lips were split and bleeding, leaving a metallic taste of rust and copper in my dry mouth. I couldn't sweat anymore. That was the most dangerous sign. My skin was hot, flush, and bone dry. But my suffering was nothing compared to the guilt of watching Diesel. My beautiful, resilient rescue dog was fading before my eyes. He was lying entirely flat in the dirt under the narrow strip of shade provided by the van's chassis. His breathing was no longer a pant. It was a shallow, ragged wheeze. His thick double coat was heavily dusted with red dirt, and his normally alert, upright ears were pinned back in exhaustion. His gums, usually a healthy pink, had turned dangerously pale. Yet, even in the grip of severe heat stroke, his loyalty remained terrifyingly absolute. Every few minutes, he would force his heavy head up, drag himself an inch closer, and rest his dry, rough snout against my thigh. It was a silent check-in, a reassurance. I'm still here. Are you still here? He wasn't whimpering or crying. He was facing the end with a quiet dignity I didn't possess. I stared at the empty blue plastic jug resting between my boots. The reality of my failure was absolute. I had brought this incredible creature into the wilderness to heal my own brokenness, and my negligence was going to kill him. I couldn't fix the engine. I couldn't make it rain. I couldn't undo the mistakes that led us to this forsaken stretch of BLM road. But I had one last thing I could do. I picked up the plastic jug. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely unscrew the cap. I tipped the container sideways, watching the pathetic, agonizingly small amount of warm water slide toward the opening. It wasn't even a mouthful. It was merely a splash, maybe 2 tablespoons of tepid liquid that had been baking in the back of the van. I carefully poured the final drops into the blue plastic cap. It was a miserable offering, a symbol of my ultimate failure, but it was the only life-giving thing left in our world. I slid off the tire I was leaning against and crawled onto my hands and knees in the dirt, ignoring the burning earth against my skin. I moved toward Diesel. He watched me approach, his amber eyes half-lidded but still tracking my every movement. "Here, buddy," I croaked. My voice was a broken, raspy whisper that sounded like sandpaper scraping against stone. "Drink it, please." I held the blue cap out, my hand shaking, and placed it right beneath his chin. Diesel didn't immediately move. He stared at the cap. He knew what it was. His dry, cracked nose twitched slightly as he caught the scent of the water. He let out a long, shuddering breath. I waited for survival instinct to kick in, for the desperate, frantic lapping of a dying animal. Instead, Diesel slowly lifted his massive head. He didn't look at the water. He looked directly into my eyes. For a long suspended second, the desert silence deepened, amplifying the profound, unspoken conversation between a broken man and a dog who knew exactly what was happening. He saw my trembling hands. He felt my fear. He understood that this was the very last of it. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, Diesel lowered his snout. He didn't open his mouth. He simply placed the tip of his dry nose against the edge of the blue plastic cap and gently pushed it backward. He nudged it across the dirt, pushing it directly against my chest. He refused to drink. I stared at him, my mind unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My chest heaved, a ragged sob tearing through my raw throat. The corporate executive who thought he had the world figured out, the man who believed love was a transaction and loyalty could be bought, shattered entirely into the Arizona dust. I broke down. I buried my face into Diesel's neck, wrapping my arms around his hot, dusty body, crying tears I didn't have the hydration to shed. In the face of death, an abused shelter dog had just chosen my life over his own. I don't know how long I stayed like that, buried in the harsh, dusty fur of the only family I had left. My tears had dried into tight, salty tracks on my cheeks. My vision was swimming, the edges of the world turning a bruised, blurry purple. I was preparing to close my eyes, hoping the end would come quietly for both of us. Then, the ground trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a mechanical vibration, a low, rhythmic rumble that cut through the oppressive silence of the dead desert. I forced my heavy eyelids open and turned my head. Emerging from the shimmering heat mirages, about a mile down the cracked dirt road, was a massive plume of white dust. A Bureau of Land Management patrol truck was tearing down trail, its heavy tires chewing up the alkaline earth. Within minutes, doors were slamming, heavy boots crunched on the dirt. I remember the sharp sound of a radio crackling, and then the most glorious sensation I have ever experienced, the icy rush of bottled water being poured over the back of my neck. They didn't ask questions. They took one look at my broken econoline, my blistered face, and the massive German shepherd lying listlessly in the dirt, and they moved with practiced urgency. One officer handed me a gallon jug, ordering me to sip slowly, while the other brought a collapsible canvas bowl and filled it to the brim for Diesel. I watched, my hands still shaking violently, as Diesel lifted his heavy head and began a lap at the water. The desperate, splashing sound of his drinking was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. We didn't lose the van. A heavy-duty tow truck dragged us 40 miles back to a sprawling, neon-lit truck stop on the edge of the interstate. By the time the mechanic confirmed the engine block wasn't completely cracked and began replacing the ruptured radiator, the sun had finally surrendered, sinking below the jagged Arizona canyon walls. The desert is a landscape of violent extremes. The 110-degree furnace of the afternoon rapidly gave way to the sharp, biting chill of the desert night. The sky transformed into an endless, magnificent canopy of brilliant diamond-hard stars, completely untouched by city lights. I sat cross-legged on the cool dirt beside the open side door of the camper van, bathed in the warm, golden glow of our small, portable campfire. The mechanic's garage was quiet now, the distant hum of highway traffic serving as a gentle white noise backdrop. I had bought 2 massive, heavily marbled ribeye steaks from the truck stop diner. I cooked them over the open flame right there in the empty lot, sharing the meal with my dog beneath the starry sky. I cut one into thick, rare slices and dropped them into Diesel's battered metal bowl. He was exhausted, still recovering from the severe heat stroke, but his appetite had returned. I watched him eat, listening to the steady, comforting sound of his breathing in the cool night air. I leaned back against the rear tire of the van, the cold rubber pressing against my spine, and pulled Diesel close to me. He didn't resist. He crawled into my lap, resting his heavy, warm head against my chest, letting out a long, contented sigh. I buried my face in his thick fur, wrapping my arms tightly around his broad shoulders, whispering words of profound, boundless gratitude into the quiet night. Sitting there under the vast, indifferent expanse of the cosmos, something inside me finally broke. It wasn't a break of despair, but of absolute release. The crushing weight of my past, the bitter divorce, the corporate burnout, the relentless, Suffocating pressure of a life I had built on empty ambitions was gone. The harsh, unforgiving nature of the desert had somehow scoured away all my old sorrows, offering me a completely new perspective on what it meant to be alive. It had stripped me down to the very marrow of my existence, forcing me to confront what actually mattered. When you face the very real prospect of dying, the things you thought were important suddenly evaporate. I didn't care about the six-figure salary I had lost. I didn't care about the corner offices or the title they stripped from me. All I cared about was the rhythmic heartbeat of the rescue dog resting against my ribs. I stroked his battered ears, tracing the faded scars left by a world that had been so relentlessly cruel to him. They tell you that adopting a shelter dog is a noble thing. They pat you on the back and tell you how wonderful it is that you saved a life from being destroyed. But as I looked down at Diesel, the dog who had calmly pushed his last chance at survival back toward my chest just hours earlier, I knew the absolute truth. I was never the savior in this story. I hadn't rescued this beautiful, broken German shepherd. He had rescued me. The dawn broke over the Arizona desert, not with the furious, punishing heat of the day before, but with a delicate, painted beauty. Ribbons of bruised purple and soft, glowing tangerine stretched across the vast, uninterrupted horizon. The air was incredibly crisp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of cold alkaline dust and wild sagebrush. I stood outside the mechanic's gravel lot, a steaming mug of cheap, black diner coffee warming my hands, and just watched the world wake up. Inside the van, I could hear the familiar, heavy thud of Diesel's tail thumping against the wooden floorboards. The sound made a slow, involuntary smile spread across my face, a genuine smile, something that felt entirely foreign on my own features after so many years of running. When I slid the side door open, he was waiting for me. His thick, dark coat had been thoroughly brushed free of the red desert dirt, and his amber eyes were bright, alert, and entirely devoid of the terrifying lethargy that had gripped him yesterday. He let out a low, happy rumble and pressed his massive head firmly into my hip. I reached down, burying my fingers in the dense fur behind his ears, scratching exactly where he loved it. "Ready to get out of here, buddy?" I asked softly. He answered with a sharp, eager bark, his ears standing tall and perfectly pointed. He was ready. He was always ready as long as we were together. The mechanic had finished the repairs late in the night. The rusted, blown-out radiator was gone, replaced by a gleaming new unit, and the engine fluids were topped off and sealed. I paid the bill with a profound sense of relief, tossing the keys into the ignition. When I turned it, the old 2004 Econoline roared to life with a steady, reassuring purr. There was no hesitation, no sickening hiss of escaping steam, just the deep, reliable rumble of a machine ready to eat up the miles. We pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the endless, black ribbon of the interstate. The road stretched out before us, cutting directly through the heart of the American Southwest. The towering, jagged silhouettes of red rock canyons rose in the distance, standing like ancient sentinels guarding the secrets of the wild. I rolled down the passenger window. Instantly, Diesel stepped up onto the console, resting his heavy front paws on the armrest, and shoved his head out into the rushing wind. His eyes squinted against the morning glare, his ears pinned back by the sheer force of the air, and his tongue lolled out in an expression of pure, unadulterated joy. He was taking in the thousands of complex scents of the desert, living entirely in the exact present moment. Watching him, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. People who have never lived this life often ask me the same question. Isn't it lonely? They see the metal box I live in. They see the empty, desolate stretches of highway, the secluded off-grid campsites, the weeks spent wandering the American wilderness without seeing another human soul. They assume that because I left the crowded streets of the city behind, I must be drowning in a state of perpetual isolation. But as the tires hummed against the asphalt and the Arizona sun began to cast long golden shadows across the dashboard, I realized just how wrong that assumption was. You are never truly alone when you have a loyal dog walking beside you. In the city, surrounded by millions of people, I had been completely agonizingly isolated. I had been suffocating under the weight of my own burnout, the ghost of my failed marriage, and the hollow expectations of a world that didn't actually care if I breathed. But out here, I was finally part of a family again. The desert had stripped away my ego, my grief, and my lingering regrets. It had pushed me to the absolute edge of survival, only to show me that the most valuable thing I possessed wasn't a bank account or a job title. It was the unwavering, unconditional love of an 80-pound rescue dog who had been willing to trade his final breath for mine. I reached across the center console and rested my hand on Diesel's back. He didn't pull his head inside. He just leaned his weight into my touch, a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond forged in the fires of yesterday. The trauma of the past wasn't magically erased. The scars of my old life were still there, etched into my history, but they no longer controlled the steering wheel. They were just scenery in the rearview mirror, fading further in the distance with every mile marker we passed. We had survived the worst the wild had to throw at us, and we had come out the other side entirely renewed. We were given a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste a single second of it. As the desert highway unfurled toward the horizon, an open invitation to whatever lay ahead, I looked into the camera lens mounted on my dash. If you're out there watching this, and you're feeling trapped in a life that feels like it's slowly crushing you, don't be afraid to walk away. Don't be afraid to start completely over. Nature has a brutal, beautiful way of breaking you down just so it put you back together exactly how you were meant to be. And if you're lucky enough to have a four-legged best friend sitting shotgun, you already have everything you need to survive. I paused, letting the wind and the hum of the engine fill the silence. Has a rescue dog ever changed the trajectory of your life? Have they ever pulled you out of the darkness when you thought you couldn't go on? Tell me your story down in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and if you want to keep riding shotgun with Diesel and me as we chase the horizon, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more road left to cover.